Well, welcome back, Michael. I'm looking forward to continuing our discussion on Alfred North Whitehead and learning more about how his insights as a mathematician influenced the development of his philosophy of organism that we began talking about in the last episode.
Thank you, James. I'm excited to see where our journey a little bit deeper into Whitehead's thought takes us and how he also helps us further understand how we can bring Plato into the 21st century.
Yeah, well, a few things from our previous discussion really stand out in my mind. We spoke about Whitehead's disavowal of scientific materialism, which emerged in the wake of Isaac Newton's discoveries in the 17th and 18th centuries, which led science to adopting a view of the universe as a collection of discrete particles. And so, as you explained, Whitehead came to view mathematical patterns as describing continuous processes of universal transformation, which were, as I understand from your description, core to his philosophy of organism. And so, unlike the materialist perspective that explains scientific phenomena as the result of discrete particle interactions, Whitehead viewed all of the parts of the universe as interconnected and affecting each other. We read one of Whitehead's favorite passages from Plato in Timaeus 36e to 37c, which highlights that the universe is an organism, a living thing, as Timaeus called it, that's self moving, that has a soul, and consists of temporal things that come to be from their participation in the things that are eternal. And that was a phrase I think that you used and said was very key to Platonic philosophy. And so I think maybe we can pick up on that idea today. So, the Platonic conception of the universe with a soul that occupies two realms, one called being, that's eternal, unchanging, and not physical, and the other called becoming, which is physical and in a continuous state of change. And I think that's reflected in the metaphysics of Whitehead's landmark work called Process and Reality, which looking forward to you introducing that to us today. I thought I would actually just begin today's discussion with a brief excerpt at the very beginning of Process and Reality, in which Whitehead describes metaphysics from a philosophy of organism perspective, as it seems to me anyway, and ask if you could just expand a little bit on how this concept of metaphysics was maybe a departure from the norm during the years when Whitehead lived, which was 1861 to 1947. So I'll just read this very short bit here. One practical aim of metaphysics is the accurate analysis of propositions, not merely of metaphysical propositions, but of quite ordinary propositions such as there is beef for dinner today and Socrates is mortal. The one genus of facts which constitutes the field of some special science requires some common metaphysical presuppositions respecting the universe. It is merely credulous to accept verbal phrases as adequate statements of propositions. The distinction between verbal phrases and complete propositions is one of the reasons why the logician's rigid alternative, true or false, is so largely irrelevant for the pursuit of knowledge. So I just thought I would start with that. Maybe if you have some thoughts on that, maybe just to bring us back to that philosophy of organism.
Well, that's a great passage. Whitehead is being rather cheeky, and that's something that careful readers of his work will notice from time to time that he will um, never, he's a good Englishman. He will never insult anyone to their face, but he will make his opinions known. And here he's commenting on the growing dominance of formal logic in the conception of how metaphysics is done. This would progress through the beginning of the 20th century. And we could say that Whitehead is partially responsible for this. We mentioned last time that he and Bertrand Russell produced this extraordinary work, the Principia Mathematica, that tried to outline the logical foundations of mathematics, but where that system would be applied more broadly in the 20th century was to the analysis of language. And so what he's referring to here is this kind of tendency of those attracted to materialism to think, well, we can combine a materialist view of the world and of science with a logical view of language and thought, and that will explain everything. And what he is rejecting here is this idea that we can take formal logic, apply it to natural language sentences, and completely explain the meaning of the things that we say. Quite to the contrary, one of his big ideas is that a lot of our language, both logical and natural, is insufficient for giving a complete account of the world as it is, the world as it is in reality. And so, like many philosophers down through the ages, he will develop a more technical and original language in a work like Process and Reality, not because he's trying to be obtuse or difficult, but because he recognizes that our normal modes of speech are not always going to be adequate to reality as it is. And we're going to need new concepts and new language, language that might not be acceptable to the mainstream materialism or logicism of his day.
Interesting. Yeah, because I guess if that philosophy of organism is sort of all encompassing, one thing affects another thing, which affects another thing. Like there's no sort of discrete distinctions or lines between things as they happen, then that does seem to require a lot more broad kind of language where, things aren't truly true or false. They're not completely true and they're not completely false.
Right. Yeah, he's thinking about language as a process of approximation, that the work of metaphysics is to give a comprehensive description of reality. So he thinks that means finding a language that will combine our scientific theories and our artistic theories and our everyday lives and put all of this together into one general picture. But he also has the humility to think that no one person is going to get it right all at once. So he doesn't think his own writing is the final word, just as Plato did not think his writing was the final word. What he thought is, hey, I'm making a contribution. I'm giving us fresh language to try to understand the world, and my hope is that those who come after me will stand on my shoulders and continually refine and improve that language to approximate the truth of reality as it is in itself.
I wonder if you could just, maybe for the benefit of listeners, and because I think the word metaphysics has changed so much over time, I'm just wondering, is there any easy way or any convenient way to place Whitehead's metaphysics in the context of what had become the norm or what had over centuries been the norm?
Well, Whitehead is in some ways the last great systematic metaphysician in the Anglo-American philosophical community. So he is standing in a tradition that kind of begins with Aristotle. Aristotle writes this book that in the medieval libraries was positioned after a book called Aristotle's Physics. And so since it was the next book, they called it the book after the physics. In Greek, that's the word meta, and so it became the metaphysics. But it became a term all of its own, which means, to talk about reality in its ultimate description. And this became a tradition, a practice that was carried on through Western medieval communities, Islamic communities, Eastern, Chinese and Indian communities for centuries, and into the modern world with thinkers like Spinoza or even Immanuel Kant, who is criticizing metaphysics, but he's also doing it. But at the beginning of the 20th century, and in part from people like Bertrand Russell, who had originally been one of Whitehead's collaborators, there was this kind of revolt that began against the idea of these bold, systematic descriptions of the world. And so by the time that Whitehead is writing in the late 1920s, the dominant view in Europe and the growing view, not fully developed, but the growing view in the United States is that trying to describe the world as it really is a waste of time. That all that matters is what is useful for science and what is logically consistent, and we don't need the rest. So There's a very real sense in which Whitehead's work is somewhat outdated in a way, and that he's doing something that is no longer trendy or fashionable. But in another sense, he is holding alive the great philosophical tradition that came before him and is bearing witness to it. And his refusal to compromise and capitulate to the fashionable trends of his day, I think, is a reminder that philosophy begins with Socrates' refusal to compromise. And I think that's why Whitehead still matters for today, is he's a true philosopher, not merely a fashionable one.
That's an interesting way of putting it. And certainly one of the readings that we have today we'll talk about is kind of connection of the dialogue Timaeus that we read last time to quantum physics. And so maybe if we could start with that one, if you wouldn't mind reading that.
Yeah, so this is an excerpt from Process and Reality, pages 94, 95 of the corrected edition. And this passage really uh, brings to light what the philosophy of organism really means, which is it's this vision of the universe as an interconnected series of relations where everything that exists is a product of everything that else that exists. And everything is kind of co-creating everything else. And so it's a remarkable contrast that he draws, and we're going to see here that his foil for Plato's vision of organism will be something like a Newtonian materialist theory. Whitehead writes, quote, "In the first place, the Timaeus connects behavior with the ultimate molecular characters of the actual entities. Plato conceives the notion of definite societies of actual molecular entities, each society with its defining characteristics. Newton could have accepted a molecular theory as easily as Plato, but there is this difference between them. Newton would have been surprised at the modern quantum theory and at the dissolution of quanta into vibrations. Plato would have expected it. Plato accounted for the sharp-cut differences between kinds of natural things by assuming an approximation of the molecules of the fundamental kinds respectively to the mathematical forms of the regular solids. He also assumed that certain qualitative contrasts and occurrences, such as that between musical notes, depended on the participation of these occurrences in some of the simpler ratios between integral numbers. He thus obtained a reason why there should be an approximation to sharp-cut differences between kinds of molecules, and why there should be sharp-cut relations of harmony standing out amid dissonance. It is well to remember that the modern quantum theory, with its surprises in dealing with the atom, is only the latest instance of a well-marked character of nature, which in each particular instance is only explained by some ad hoc dogmatic assumption. The theory of biological evolution would not in itself lead us to expect the sharply distinguished genre and species which we find in nature. There might be an occasional bunching of individuals around certain typical forms, but there's no explanation of the almost complete absence of intermediate forms. Again, Newton's scholium gives no hint of the 92 possibilities for atoms, or the limited number of ways in which atoms can be combined so as to form molecules. Physicists are now explaining these chemical facts by means of conceptions which Plato would have welcomed.
I love that. Yeah, talk about bringing Plato into the 21st century with that reference to the quantum, which had been, I guess, newly defined just very shortly before Whitehead wrote this. Max Planck defined the quantum as the minimum unit of energy in the universe that can either be the cause or effect of change. And so I guess here he's talking about how that minimum unit can then expand into a whole host of things. And yeah, I think very much, as he says, Plato would welcome that, certainly from the Timaeus, which goes very deeply into the origin of the universe and all of the ratios that he talks about. When he mentions the regular solids, that's a reference to the five Platonic solids that are introduced in the Timaeus. And those are, as Plato said, how the universe is woven with those five solids, with those five regular solids. So I guess here we have a mathematician who is seeing those mathematical connections that Plato set out, seeing the geometric connections in the five regular solids, and he's relating them to the modern quantum theory, which is still not settled. I mean, it's still very much a question about how that whole quantum realm works, and scientists are still trying to reconcile that with Einstein's theory of relativity. But I guess maybe there's a philosophical approach here that could help in that reconciliation.
Absolutely. So the gist of what Whitehead is saying here is that what's missing from both a kind of crude Darwinian biology as well as Newton's molecular theory is precisely the mechanics of change. That he's saying that these theories, which we think of as introducing process to us, Newton's is based on the calculus, which is a model of motion, and Darwin is sort of breaking up this idea that species are fixed and immutable. But Whitehead's actually saying they still rely on some of these materialist assumptions that don't what's not being presented there is the precise account of how the kind of tree diagrams that evolution produces of how species relate to each other, how there's a sense in which that is to be expected given the kinds of things that the ancestral forms are. And he's saying the same thing about Newton here, that Newton's conception of the atom is not characterizing in a way that would lead us to expect something like the periodic table. And so Whitehead is saying metaphysics can be the process of drilling down to figure out what kind of description of the world do we need that is going to help us understand how those forms emerge. And the theory that he thinks we get from the Timaeus that he describes towards the beginning of the quote, he says, Plato conceives the notion of definite societies of actual molecular entities, each society with its defining characteristics. Now, this is one of Whitehead's technical terms. He starts with atomic entities, but he describes how atomic entities are always formed out of their relatedness to the universe of their past, and they evolve through their relations into the future. And he uses that inherent relatedness to describe how some of those atomic entities form what he calls societies. Now, that's a metaphor, but he's taking our understanding of what a society is, humans in relation to each other, and he's saying, well, just as we come together and we form institutions and, highways and all and languages and all these things, the exact same thing is happening at the microscopic level, where these atomic entities are forming societies of stable things over time. And those stable things have their own forms that are greater than the sum of their parts. And that's the kind of organic universe that Plato would lead you to expect. It's not the kind of universe that materialist atomism would lead you to expect, because there's no reason why an atom would participate in anything bigger than itself. It should just be atoms bouncing around for eternity, not making up things or societies, as Whitehead calls them.
Actually, you used an example, I think, last time that we were talking of where we could call it atom in state A changes to atom in state B. And the scientific materialist approach may be to say that it's just because of the interaction of A and B that that change happens. Whereas I think you said last time that it's because of all of the interactions of everything else that A moves to B. It's not a simple one step process, it's a infinite step process, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the things that Whitehead does in Process and Reality is he bases each atomic entity on Leibniz's monad. So, for those who are not familiar with Gottfried Leibniz and his theory of the monad, Leibniz says that each atomic entity is a reflection of the whole universe. Now, in Leibniz's theory, these monads were completely self-contained and cut off from everything else. Whitehead inverts that, and he says that each thing that exists is a reflection of the universe, but it's because they're connected to everything else within their causal horizon. So he famously says that Leibniz calls the monads windowless because nothing comes in or out. He says, whereas my atomic entities are all window. And I love that as a metaphor. They're nothing but window. Everything is connected. Everything comes in, and each atomic entity then becomes a factor for everything else evolving into the future. And so it's this incredible web, but it's not a synchronic web of a present moment in time, although there is that. We can talk about what simultaneity means. It's a temporal web across time of things evolving into other things. And the goal of metaphysics, he thinks, is to describe how that process produces Platonic forms, not just at the atomic level, but at higher order levels that lead to macroscopic entities like ourselves.
And you mentioned time, temporal, which I mentioned as well in the introduction. So you talked a little bit about how Whitehead saw time. And I'm wondering maybe if you could expand on that a little bit more in terms of the connection of time to the physical things, so that, if all of these changes are happening, and we hear the word harmonics in this, as we heard last time as well. So there's some harmony of everything in time. But I'm just wondering, like, what's the fundamental relationship between time and physical things in his view?
Well, that's a big question because Whitehead is going to reject the standard static view of time that was popular in the wake of general relativity. This is the view that says, well, time is a fourth dimension, but it's just like the other three dimensions. It's sort of already there. And so this would lead, again, Whitehead's collaborator, Bertrand Russell, to deny the reality of causation. He would say, no, time is just the ordering of physical things on the fourth dimension, and so nothing is causing anything. We're just describing, where they are relative to each other on the fourth dimension, just the same way we talk about left and right and north and south in the ordinary three dimensions. And so Whitehead is very aware of that view. And so what he says is, well, that's a view of metrical time. That's a technical term that he talks about, time as this linear ordering of discrete points. And he says that belongs to the realm of what Plato calls appearance. It's like the emergence, how things appear to us. In reality, the actual way the world is, reality is a series of processes in different stages of process. And it would be misleading to call that time in the ordinary sense because it's not the kind of thing you can measure metrically. Again, metrical time is a sort of emergent property of this process. The only way you can talk about it is in series of stages, stage one, stage two, stage three. And so in process and reality, he tries to relate these things to each other. And he says what physicists are doing is they're measuring metrical time, this kind of emergent phenomena of the processes of the universe. And they're mistakenly taking that to be the ultimate description of the universe, that the universe is just this fixed block of ordered fourth dimensional events. And he says, no, 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 that's the emergent. The real thing is this qualitative, non non-measurable in the traditional sense ordering of sequences. And so he calls that whole thing the genealogical view of reality because the only way we can talk about it is in terms of ancestors and descendants rather than, space-time point one, space-time point two, space-time point three. So it's a really interesting and kind of radical view of time, but the point is to preserve our deepest intuition about time, which is that time passes. And he felt like the physicists of his day were denying the passage of time. And so that's the core thing that he's trying to preserve with his process theory.
Interesting. And so time is not a linear, it's not a linear thing. It's something that I wouldn't say it, well, I guess when I was talking about the Critias back in a much earlier episode of Plato's Pod, we developed the idea, it seemed that time from that was more of a circular thing rather than just a linear thing. The effect of one cause becomes the cause of the next effect, which becomes the cause of the subsequent effect, and so on. So it's never just a absolutely linear process. Starts at one and it ends at infinity, or infinity minus one. So yeah, it's interesting. It's something that it's a question that occurred to me in that thought about harmonics and motion, about how everything sort of fits together. And of course, Plato very much talks about change and motion is very key to knowledge, actually, is understanding how those changes correlate over time. And that's how we form knowledge.
Absolutely. So, this might be a good chance, James, to have you read an excerpt from Plato. So, last time we talked about one of the key passages for Whitehead from the Timaeus, but there's another key passage for Whitehead. This comes from the Sophist, which is primarily a dialogue about knowledge, but it's also about metaphysics and lots of things. And this is one of the passages that Whitehead would regularly point to, and we're going to actually read an excerpt in a little bit where he does just that. This is a passage he would point to when he was trying to push against the assumptions of the academy in his day that Plato doesn't care about the material world. He only cares about the heavens with the fixed forms and whatnot. And he sort of felt that that came from a very limited reading of Plato's canon rather than reading the full body of the dialogues. The Sophist is one of the later dialogues, one of the last things that Plato writes. And so this passage here is one of the key excerpts that he points to that shows that Plato actually cares about motion, about change, about process. So go ahead and read it for us, and then we can chat about it.
That's great. Yeah, and certainly there are the two different parts of the universe. There's the realm of being, which is the static maybe realm, but there's a realm of becoming. And Plato talks about how those two are combined. And so this excerpt starts by talking about that which wholly is, which I would read as including both being and becoming, not just being, as you said, but both being and becoming. So there's two speakers in this. There's a visitor from Elia, and there's Theaetetus. Would you like to be Theaetetus and I'll be the visitor?
Okay.
All right. So the visitor starts, and this is Sophist 249a, I believe. But for heaven's sake, are we going to be convinced that it's true that change, life, soul, and intelligence are not present in that which wholly is, and that it neither lives nor thinks, but stays changeless, solemn, and holy without any understanding?
If we did, sir, we'd be admitting something frightening.
But are we going to say that it has understanding but doesn't have life?
Of course not.
But are we saying that it has both these things in it while denying that it has them in a soul?
How else would it have them?
And are we saying that it has intelligence, life, and soul, but that it's at rest and completely changeless, even though it's alive?
All that seems completely unreasonable.
Then both that which changes and also change have to be admitted as being.
Of course.
And so, Theaetetus, it turns out that if no beings change, then nothing anywhere possesses any intelligence about anything.
Absolutely not.
But furthermore, if we admit that everything is moving and changing, then on what account we take the very same thing away from those which are?
Wait, why?
Do you think that without rest, anything would be the same in that same state in the same respects?
Not at all.
Well, then, do you see any case in which intelligence is or comes to be anywhere without these things?
Not in the least.
And we need to use every argument we can to fight against anyone who does away with knowledge, understanding, and intelligence, but at the same time asserts anything at all about anything.
Definitely.
The philosopher, the person who values these things the most, absolutely has to refuse to accept the claim that everything is at rest, either from defenders of the one or from friends of the many forms. In addition, he has to refuse to listen to people who make that which is change in every way. He has to be like a child begging for both and say that which is, everything, is both the unchanging and that which changes. And that ends that section from 249a to d of the Sophist. The Sophist, that's where I always refer to the five key forms of motion which appear in the Sophist. That which is, the same, the different, change and rest. So here he's talking about change and rest and that which is. And I think that's key to knowledge is understanding how all of those fit together. We talked a little bit last time about the one and the many. And I guess here there's a reference to that sort of thing. Is everything just one state of rest, or are there many states and many stages of knowledge that one gains in the course of understanding those connections?
Yeah, wonderful. I really love this passage. The final part that you read there, I think it's important to highlight for listeners that this is such a great model of how Plato is always first and foremost interrogating himself. I mean, that's why he writes dialogues, is to model that kind of epistemic humility for all of us. So there's sort of three people who are in mind here as he writes this paragraph. One is Parmenides, who is the great philosopher of the one, who believes that everything is at rest, there is no motion. Another is Heraclitus, who we mentioned last time. He's the great philosopher of who says that which is changes in every way. Heraclitus's famous phrase is all things flow. But he also includes himself here. He says, we must refuse to accept the claim that everything is at rest, either from defenders of the one, that's Parmenides, or from friends of the many forms. Well, Plato is the friend of the many forms. He's the great defender of the forms. And it's not that he's rejecting anything here. He's very clear. It's rather to say that that which is reality includes both the unchanging, the many forms, the one, and that which changes. And so, this is his own recognition that early in his life he was defending the forms because he was speaking to people who were materialists and thought there was nothing that transcended the material world. But now he's recognizing that he has to be a little more nuanced and show people how the forms come into the flux of everyday living.
I had the occasion to reread part of the dialogue, the Parmenides, recently, and I'm always struck by Parmenides' final words in that, where he says, "If the one is not, then nothing is." And I kind of read that as a way of saying that the whole, which is what the visitor starts by talking about here, the whole is the one, but the one comes to be in many parts. I'm not sure that that's really saying that there are many and sundry forms. I mean, there's that famous analogy that Parmenides uses in that dialogue about putting a sail over a whole bunch of people. And he asks young Socrates, is the sail divided among each of those people, or is it one sail? And so that's kind of the, maybe the one or many argument there. But I see the key thing in that is the idea, underlying that is the idea that the universe itself has a soul. And I'm reading that soul as the one. And everything comes to be because of that soul, which is what Timaeus says in the dialogue to Timaeus. Before there was anything physical, there was the soul. And it's the soul is older than anything, and it's because of the soul that physical things come to be. But that soul resides in the realm of being, which is the non-physical realm. So maybe there's that kind of connection here with this, the idea of the one and the many. Maybe it's not that different from what Whitehead is saying.
No, absolutely. There are two different ways of being the one. one way of being the one is through a monist philosophy like Parmenides, which says ultimately there are no differences between anything. The one is a perfectly homogeneous, differentless, uniform, imagine like a sphere that's completely solid all the way through and has no parts, no atoms that make it up. That is not Plato's view. Plato believes in the living thing. Well, again, think about the metaphor of the organism. Organisms are made up of organs, and organs are made up of cells, and cells are made up of proteins, and protein, and it's on and on and on. I mean, this is a deep tapestry of interconnections. And I really like in this passage where the problem with saying that everything is changeless is that it neither lives nor thinks. And so Plato is understanding that if you have a static universe where the fourth dimension is not about things moving, going through process, the passage of time, but it's just the serial ordering of events relative to each other on this fourth spatial dimension, then nothing lives or thinks. And as Theaetetus responds, we'd be admitting something frightening if that was true. But that can't be right because earlier in the dialogue, it's already been established that there is understanding. And if there's understanding, there must be life. You can't understand anything unless you're alive. And you can't be alive and have understanding if there is no soul, because soul is the animating principle and unity that makes possible being alive and having understanding. And so although this is a conversation about bringing change and changelessness together under one conception of reality, it is also a critique of a materialist perspective that says if the universe really was nothing but dead matter banging around, there would be no soul and therefore no life and therefore no understanding. So, since there is understanding and there is life, there must be soul.
Yeah, that which wholly is includes intelligence. And I think that's the one thing that the modern scientific approach has not yet dealt with is how did intelligence emerge from a bunch of particles banging around, as you said. Whereas the Platonic concept is, well, the reason is because it existed before the particles, and the particles are a product of the soul. That's the really organic view of things, I guess. Whereas the kind of magical view of things is that the particles came to be, and somehow by some form of magic, a soul emerged, or 8 billion souls emerge as we now have on the planet Earth. So yeah, very interesting passage, and certainly one that deals with that philosophy of organism. Everything is a big organism, including intelligence, in with the physical things. So intelligence, again, being in the realm of being, a faculty of the soul and not of the physical. And it's how those two fit together that we form knowledge, and using those five key forms of motion that I mentioned earlier, that which is the same, the different, and change and rest. It's a key passage, I think, to understanding Plato, but I really do get a sense of Whitehead's philosophy of organism from this passage.
Yeah, it serves kind of two functions for Whitehead. I mean, one, it's one of his proof texts against the people who have this bad stereotype of Plato. But the other function it has for him is it's a blueprint for the project of metaphysics, as readers hopefully made the connection to some of the excerpts we read in the previous episode, that he thinks of metaphysics as having certain problems set before it that then a good metaphysical theory will solve. And the problem here is how to bring the changing and the unchanging together under one framework and one world. So the thing he's rejecting here, and he believes Plato is rejecting, and I agree with him, is the two worlds theory. This is the idea that, well, the forms are off in heaven somewhere, and becoming is down here, and never shall the two meet. And that's an easy way to explain the changing and the unchanging because they don't have any, they basically don't exist in the same reality. But the problem is obviously if you only live in one world, how do we even know about the other world? But the other problem is it just doesn't seem to have anything to do with Plato because Plato is the great philosopher of participation, as we mentioned last time. That his whole point is how the world of becoming participates in the forms. And so you can't have this two world theory to really correctly understand Plato. So Plato must be doing something else. And Whitehead sort of sees passages like this as laying out the program for any future metaphysics on how to correctly understand what Plato is doing and then build on that to give a modern theory of metaphysics for today. What do I mean by modern? Well, for Whitehead, that meant a theory of metaphysics that incorporates the insights of general relativity, that incorporates the insights of quantum physics, that incorporates the insights of modern evolutionary biology, that incorporates whatever other scientific, artistic, religious discoveries we've made. So obviously we've learned something since Plato. We're not saying that we've never learned anything since Plato, but we're saying that we have to build on the foundation and the blueprint that Plato set down. So, as we're going to see when we read our next Whitehead passage, he refers to this particular excerpt as the life and motion passage. This is where Plato is making the case for life and motion as being part of our fundamental description of the universe.
Mhm. And that's a good way of putting it. It really does remind me too of the divided line of knowledge from Plato's Republic, where the line is divided into two sections. The first section of knowledge we gain just by sensory data, receiving these images, maybe illusions like the allegory of the cave where the prisoner is looking at the cave wall and just receiving the images, but not understanding where they come from. And so in the divided line of knowledge, that first section, we can only make hypotheses about what we see. To move into the second section of the divided line of knowledge, we then need to transcend. The mind needs to go up into that realm of being and start looking for things like the same and the different, change and rest. And I think primarily the equal, which is a big theme throughout Plato. We have to look for the equal, which is that which divides things. And that's only where the mind has access to the equal. And that's where we determine what's the same and what's changed and where the differences lie. And that's, I think, real knowledge. And it's a concept that was written by Plato 2,400 years ago, but I think it applies just as much or maybe even more to gaining knowledge now, where things are not necessarily true or false, as that first little passage that I read. It's sort of a continuum of constant change, and we always have to be looking for that dividing line that determines whether we know something or whether we don't know something. Well, do you want to go ahead then? And I think you have this excerpt from Whitehead's Modes of Thought, which I think you mentioned. You talked a little bit about modes of thought in our last episodes, but maybe you could just kind of place this in the context of process and reality and bring us back to how this relates to his thinking about Plato.
Yeah, so if we think of Whitehead's biography as sort of having its climax at the publication of Process and Reality, that's his big magnum opus. There are a handful of works that he wrote in anticipation of that, and then there are a handful of works that he wrote in the aftermath of that that are attempts to synthesize the thought, restate it, put it in a more digestible form. And Modes of Thought is a book that was published in, I think, around 1937, 38. And it's a collection of three separate lecture series that he gave at universities around the East Coast in the United States. But in those lectures, he really presents a more intuitive presentation of the major ideas in process and reality. And for that reason, it's just got some really fantastic synopses of his thought. And this comes from the six-part lecture series that opens the book, where he's really kind of working through some of the big key details. And here in this passage that we're going to read, he's going to make a comment about Plato and also David Hume. And he's going to do something kind of similar with each, which is he's going to challenge our assumptions or stereotypes about these philosophers. And it's a great passage because it shows how Whitehead read the history of philosophy, but it also shows some of the ways that he's applying these ideas to solve particular concrete problems. So, in the second half of this excerpt, listeners should pay attention to some of the actual development of the mechanics of the theory of process that you're going to hear in here. Do you want me to go ahead and read it, James?
Yeah, please.
So, this is from the chapter Perspective and Modes of Thought, which is on pages 82 through 85 of the Free Press edition. Unfortunately, there are no official editions, so the pagination varies widely, but it's in the chapter Perspective. Whitehead writes, "The distorted attitude of attention to static forms has haunted philosophy, but it has not exclusively dominated it. The outstanding figures in the philosophic tradition have not achieved eminence solely by their championship of systems peculiar to themselves. Systematic thought has clarified insights, and it has directed attention to aspects of experience which exemplify special systems. But the universe stretches beyond our finite powers of understanding. The great thinkers from whom we derive inspiration enjoyed insights beyond their own systems. They made statements hard to reconcile with the neat little ways of thought which we pin on to their names. For example, the same philosopher, Plato, who emphasized the changeless mathematical entities as characteristic components of supreme reality, also elsewhere declared life and motion to belong to the essential character of reality. He thus asked, how do things function, as a way of understanding how those things exist? Again, another philosopher, David Hume, who reduces the connection between the data of experience to mere succession of sense data, also appeals to the fact of expectation. This derivation of expectation from succession is an intelligible fact to Hume, although his own system provides no elucidation of it. We do not experience mere succession. We discern forms of succession, and the presupposition of such forms haunts philosophic thought and dominates our daily experience. Plato and Hume illustrate that system is essential for rational thought. But they also illustrate that the closed system is the death of living understanding. In their explanations, they wander beyond all system. They thus illustrate in their own procedures that our primary insight is a mixture of clarity and vagueness. The finite focus of clarity fades into an environment of vagueness, stretching into the darkness of what is merely beyond. The partly comprehended forms of succession dimly illuminate this environment within experience. We require to understand how the mere existence of unchanging form requires its own immersion in the creation of a changing historic world. There is a form of creation. We require to understand how the unity of the universe requires its multiplicity. We require to understand how infinitude requires the finite. We require to understand how each immediately present existence requires its past, antecedent to itself, and requires its future, an essential factor in its own existence. There are thus three factors within immediate existence: namely past, present, and future. In this way, immediacy of finite existence refuses to be deprived of that infinitude of extension, which is its perspective. Again, we require to understand how mere matter of fact refuses to be deprived of its relevance to potentialities beyond its own actuality of realization. The very character of concrete realization, that is to say, of historic fact, is suffused with the potentialities which it excludes with varying types of relevance. In the present fact, there are the various characteristics of the past, partly reproduced and partly excluded. There are the characteristics of concurrent facts in the present, partly shared in and partly excluded. There are the possibilities for the future, partly prepared for and partly excluded. The discussion of present fact, apart from reference to past, to concurrent present, and to future, and from reference to the preservation or destruction of forms of creation, is to rob the universe of essential importance. In the absence of perspective, there is triviality. Finally, there are two ultimate types of existence implicated in the creative process. The eternal forms with their dual existence in potential appetition and in realized fact, and realized fact with its dual ways of existence as the past in the present and as the immediacy of the present. Also, the immediacy of the present harbors an appetition towards the unrealized future. Now, this passage will probably occupy us for the rest of our discussion. There's so much here. And before I hand it over to you, James, I want to just highlight one kind of unifying thread for our listeners to kind of understand what's happening here. That section kind of in the middle of what I read, where he kind of has this litany of we require, we require, we require. That's Whitehead stating the problems, the bare facts of reality as we find it that a metaphysics has to account for. He's sort of stating, this is the project that I am working on. And agree or disagree with me, these are the brute facts of our experience that any good metaphysics will have to take into account. Now, of course, he does very clearly allude to how he's solving these or accounting for these brute facts in the rest of the passage. But in case listeners missed it, I wanted to highlight one phrase of his right before that that kind of unifies the whole passage, where he says, he talks about the partly comprehended forms of succession. So that is his masterful phrase where he is trying to elucidate what's happening in that passage we read from the Sophist, that's unifying the changeless forms with the changing world of becoming. He just beautifully brings that together by saying, yes, we're talking about the forms of succession. Succession clearly implicating change process, but these forms are forms of that. The unchanging things are what give intelligibility to our experience of succession, of the passage of time, of, as he said at the end, the present moment harboring an appetition towards the unrealized future. So, with that, I'll turn it over to you, James, to continue our discussion on this passage.
Yeah, that's great. I like the way you said that the unchanging forms give intelligibility. It's not that, we exist in an unchanging form, but it's the intelligibility, I think, is the key. Yeah, there's a bunch of interesting things in this. I noted the word haunt a few times. I wondered when he says, they thus illustrate in their own procedures that our primary insight is a mixture of clarity and vagueness. I wonder if that's has to do with the haunting aspect, in that we never really fully know. Is that kind of what he's referring to in terms of haunting?
Partially, yes. I think there's a more direct meaning, but it's even better for bolstering, I think, the point that you're getting at. The haunting here is he means it's almost very close to the metaphor of, a poltergeist or a ghost haunting you. It's something you can't quite get rid of. What he's getting at is that this struggle of a lot of his contemporaries and those who have gone before him to fully admit life and motion into their philosophical frameworks. And instead, they're haunted by this temptation to create these systematic metaphysical theories that are themselves changeless. That like, okay, I've given this final description for all time, which is what I think you're getting at. And now anybody who comes after me, like they'll never improve on this. I'm done. And he's saying that temptation to systematize in that way is a vestige of that earlier belief that reality is in its ultimate description, this fixed, unchanging thing. And so the two kind of go together. And so he's modeling for us a truly systematic philosopher. There, without question, Whitehead is one of the great systematic philosophers of history. But it's not the kind of system that he's presenting as this unchanging thing. Instead, he's very attentive to talking about the history that preceded his system, talking about people like Plato and Hume, so that you can see that his system is an evolution of earlier systems, and then being very open about the expectation that the philosophers who come after him will modify and improve on his system. So he's doing this kind of meta thing where he's saying we have to allow change into our metaphysics, and simultaneously we have to allow openness and vagueness to be part of our systematic philosophizing.
And certainly the way he characterizes time here, and I asked earlier about time, but I'm seeing now more clearly, I think, how he sees time when he says the very character of concrete realization, that is to say, of historical fact, is suffused with the potentialities which it excludes with varying types of relevance. In the present fact, there are the various characteristics of the past, partly reproduced and partly excluded. There are the characteristics of concurrent facts in the present, partly shared and partly excluded. And there are the possibilities of the future, partly prepared for and partly excluded. So I guess maybe I'm reading that as nothing is really what we think is done and said and done isn't really said and done, right?
Yeah, that's right. And again, the way you're reading that is just wonderful because you're noticing that there's both a direct level and a kind of meta level. So this language of inclusion and exclusion is getting at the deep character of how change works, that change is not the repetition of the same. Parents don't give birth to carbon copies of themselves. Their kids are a little bit different. And then their kids are even further different and further and so on until, after 5 generations, that generation won't resemble their great great grandparents hardly at all. Okay. So change is not repetition of the same. And in a similar way, our systematizing is not repetition of the same. Each philosopher is bringing in something new. And so that's a process of recognizing that some of what went before is preserved and some is discarded, or in his term, excluded. So he's trying to get us to see process itself as a sequence of transformations in which some forms are brought forward, some forms are excluded, and then he also talks about potentialities. Potentialities there means forms that are not there in the material inheritance. So, um, I have characteristics in my physical person that don't have an antecedent in my parents' genome because there was a funny mutation that happened somewhere. That's a potentiality that came from without. It wasn't a direct inheritance of the material background of my being. And that's really important for Whitehead. He says that's how the creative process actually happens, is that the horizon of possibilities is not limited to the material facts of the world as it was prior to that immediate process. That process also has potentialities open to it, that is, forms that are unrealized, but it can be possibly realized in that new process and sometimes are. And that's how completely new emergences happen in the universe. So earlier you were talking about the emergence of life in the history of our Earth. Well, that's an instance of a new form. Now, the form was always eternal, okay? Meaning, what that means is the possibility of the form was always there in the nature of the cosmos, okay? But the actual emergence of life on planet Earth happened at a particular moment in time because the potentiality of that process became possible, that that process could introduce something new into the universe that hadn't been there before.
It really makes me think of Timaeus 36e, which is just after, or sorry, 37e, which is just after the section that we read in our last episode, where there's that long, not a long, but a whole paragraph talking about how we think that the future has not yet come to be, but in fact, both the past and the future have come to be, and it's the present that has not come to be. It makes me think of all of these potentialities for the future. So something happens in the past, and then all of the potentialities from those events then unfold, but it's a question maybe of which one we choose to follow in the present, which one we perceive in the present, what our knowledge in the present takes us along those future paths. So there's just that whole range of potentialities, and it's the question of knowledge to see what those potentialities are and to choose which one in that instant of the present.
Now, I really want to highlight for listeners that what you're doing is you're taking this metaphysics of process and you're applying it to us as processes. We are a process. We are creatures that are alive, that have understanding, and therefore we change. We change physically and we change mentally, right? And you are also correctly noticing that we are not so different. We are different, but we're not so different from process more generally. Now, we have the capacity of understanding, which brings responsibility. You're describing how we are responsible for the potentialities that we bring into existence. And that's what's special about us, that we can take responsibility for our change. Other living things, maybe not as much. Maybe they have some responsibility, but it's more constrained because they have less understanding. But he does think, Whitehead does think that all processes have this kind of selection to them. Now, he doesn't think it's using understanding or free will or anything like that. He just thinks that the right way to understand change is to think of it as a kind of selection being made relative to including and excluding some things from the past and incorporating some potentialities. And he thinks that's true even down to the quantum level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as I think about what we're talking here and about what the listeners are hearing, that is a process, and we may change what we think based on what we're saying now. So, we have the ability to perceive different things based on what we're hearing, and I guess that's the benefit of dialectic in Plato's dialogues. The other thing that really struck me in this was another connection to Plato when he says that the unity of the universe requires its multiplicity. We require to understand how infinitude requires the finite. And that to me relates entirely to Philebus, which talks, Plato's Philebus, which talks about how everything consists of a portion of the unlimited and a portion of the limited. And, the way I see that, the unlimited is that realm of being, and the limited is in the realm of becoming, where everything is always changing. There's always limitations. Nothing ever exists for any extent of time. And so I see that connection very much in what he says here, that it's that multiplicity and infinitude and the finite. So, it's maybe that empowering view that the mind has that potential connection to the infinitude, whereas everything that we see around us is finite.
Yeah, so this is a part of that litany I mentioned where he's laying out the brute facts of experience that any good metaphysics has to take into account. And what's really ingenious about this, and I think very faithful to Plato, is he's taking things that other philosophers had historically made into oppositions, and he's instead requiring them to be unified under one fabric of reality. So the finite and the infinite have often been seen as, antagonistic with each other. We can't have both. And he instead says we require to understand how infinitude requires the finite. That double use of require there. So we require for metaphysics to understand how infinitude cannot do without the finite. You can't have one without the other. This is a very Whiteheadian phrase. They're mutually implicative. One implies the other. Yeah, the universe requires its multiplicity. The one implies the many imply the one. The mere existence of unchanging form requires its own immersion in the creation of a changing historic world. So that's really Whitehead doubling down on the Platonic doctrine of participation. The whole point of Plato having a theory of the forms is to explain how they participate in this world. Otherwise, what do you need them for? And we see that actually earlier when he says, Plato thus asked, how do things function as a way of understanding how those things exist? You want to know what their being is? See what they do, or to put it more explicitly, see what they aim at. What is their teleology? What is the goal of their process? And that's really a deep part of Whitehead is he's vindicating the old view that it's not just efficient causes that move the universe, it's final causes. That is, purpose is part of the universe, that things exist for something, they exist for the form of the good. And so he's recognizing that Plato is always sort of asking, what is this for? What is the goal of this? And that is really important to understand why it is the thing that it is.
Yeah, and requiring the exercise of reason. Again, with the Philebus, when they're talking about how we can't just assume that there's an absolute and then look at the multiples of those absolute things. We don't know what the absolute is. So we have to look at the multiples and then wean them down into their characteristic sets and break them down into as many parts as we can until we find the thing that's closest to the absolute, which is resonating from the Philebus in this. I wanted to ask about his use of the word appetition in the last paragraph that you read. The word twice appears. Is he talking about appetite?
It's the same root. Um, So this is, I think this comes out of Leibniz. It's a kind of neologism that he's taking from Leibniz's work. Leibniz is another Neoplatonic philosopher, and so Whitehead's being very judicious to try to draw key insights from Neoplatonists who went before him. And the idea of an appetition, yes, it is like an appetite. What does an appetite do? It moves you, right? If you are hungry, you're going to go look in the fridge. And so an appetition is it's not a simple desire though. That would probably be the wrong framing here. It's more like an urge you can't help. It's trying to get at this core idea that living things move themselves. They can't help but move themselves. It's related to an idea in Spinoza. He has this idea of the conatus, the kind of impulse that all living things have to move towards that which perpetuates their own existence. Here it's a little bit bigger than that because he's extending it to all being. He's saying everything is a process, and what that means is that no process can ever get stuck. Like you can't have a process that's like halfway there and then just stops and like remains frozen for the rest of time. That's not possible. No, every process is going to result in something else. And then that is going to be a process that results in something else. And so he's saying we can conceptually talk about the immediacy of the present, yes, but you will never fully understand the present until you understand that it harbors an appetition, an urge that it can't help to move towards an unrealized future. There's another phrase we can borrow from a contemporary philosopher of Whitehead. To my knowledge, they never read each other, but Martin Heidegger has this wonderful way of talking about time where he says, we experience the present as having been thrown into the present from the past and falling towards the future. We're thrown into the present and we're falling into the future. That is so resonant with how Whitehead is thinking of the sense of each present moment is weighted with the past that it just emerged out of, but it's being urged towards a yet unrealized future.
That's helpful. Thank you. Yeah. I'm going to go and reread that 37E from Timaeus after we finish talking because I think there's something in there that I want to be able to connect to this idea here. It's as we've talked about this section, I guess this is talking about the kind of idea, but the actual mechanics behind this. I think there's another reading that we have maybe that we could start with next time on the more mechanical process of this.
Yeah, that's right. So, listeners, as they were listening through this passage, would notice that in some ways, Whitehead is saying the same thing over and over in different ways. This constant idea about, the three factors within immediate existence, namely past, present, and future. And then he gives all these different statements about how they're oriented towards each other. And it's because his ultimate metaphysical project is to give us a framework for how to understand what process actually is and how it works. And so, yeah, maybe in our next episode, we'll read one of the more technical passages from Process and Reality, which will introduce a technical term for process that he calls concrescence. You can kind of see those words as interchangeable. But the idea here is that we actually want to understand first how an individual process receives its past into itself. And then secondly, we want to understand how an individual process becomes what he calls data for the future. Like it becomes something that then future processes will take into account. And that is going to require us to adopt a four-dimensional perspective, but not the kind of four-dimensional perspective that treats the fourth dimension as analogous to the first three dimensions, a static spatial conception, right? No, it's going to think of the fourth dimension as a kind of extended thing where it's not that, the past really does perish and the future really is not yet. I think that's pretty clear from the stuff that we've read in Whitehead. But the present is thick. You cannot slice the present in a way that says, here's an event that is simultaneous with all other events. And anybody who knows Einsteinian a cosmology will know kind of where I'm going here. This is the kind of traditional view that simultaneity cannot be universally understood under the theory of general relativity. Whitehead actually takes that and just builds that right into the metaphysical picture of the world to say that we're going to have to be comfortable with the idea that some things in our past are sort of still there because they haven't fully perished, and some things in our future are already starting to emerge, and we cannot be okay with this older view that the present is this nicely delineated moment with sharp boundaries, and the past is just gone, and the future is just not here yet. It's murkier, it's fuzzier, it's vaguer than that, and he thinks that we can explain that in a rigorous way by giving a full-fledged account of what a process is, how it works, and then most importantly, how processes compound to build more and more complex processes over time, processes like ourselves.
And I'm looking forward to getting into that. I think we're setting up a good base to understanding that now. And that's why I think at the beginning I asked about Whitehead's conception of time, which again I'm seeing more clearly here. And again, it makes me think of what Plato's characters say multiple times, that for everything there is a cause. And I guess then in Whitehead's view, for every cause there's an effect. And maybe it's like what I was saying earlier, the effect of one cause becomes the cause of the next effect, and so on. So it's this kind of
Yes.
continuous chain rather than a linear process. It's a continuous chain, and somewhere in that chain we find the present.
Yeah, I would almost say web.
Yeah.
It's a continuous web, and the present is wherever we are in the web. There's not going to be a universal present, although that doesn't mean there's not a present. It just means there's not going to be, well, as he says in this passage earlier, he says, well, he says two things. So let's see. In the absence of perspective, there is triviality. So, what he's saying is, like, what makes the present have its meaning is that you experience the present from a perspective. And trying to ask for a universal present is to ask for something that's trivial because nothing happens there, because there is a perspective. You got to have perspective in order to understand how this causal fabric has meaning. And just earlier than that, he says, in this way, immediacy of finite existence refuses to be deprived of that infinitude of extension, which is its perspective. Now, what that means is any particular perspective that we have at a given moment nonetheless has an infinite past and an infinite future. Because I mean, there's an infinite number of things that are connected to us that gave us this perspective, and then there's going to be an infinite number of things we're connected to in the future that we're going to be part of those things' perspective. So it's this wonderful way that he's blending the necessity of finitude with infinitude. Now, a listener might be wondering, okay, but why doesn't he just say cause and effect? Everybody knows those words. Well, you really got to think about the time period that he's living in. This is a time period where when people talk about cause and effect, all they mean is the serial ordering of A, then B, then C, then D. And it's this very static, as long as I said A happened, then B happened, then C happened, I've explained everything. And Whitehead wants to say, no, 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 no. It's the transition from A to B. It's the transition from B to C. That's what matters. And since the conception of cause and effect in his day was misleading, that's the reason why he has all these other ways of talking, is he's trying to use language in which you can't help but feel life and motion.
Yeah, yeah, that whole organism, the whole thing. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it makes me think of the Einsteinian view of frame of reference. You know, we all have our own frame of reference, but it all ties into one whole thing, right? So yeah, very interesting how what Whitehead, what his views are as a mathematician, as well as somebody who understands the developing science at the time, how that really brings Plato's perspectives into the 20th century, but now into the 21st century, and I think still very relevant. So this has been a great discussion. I
Yeah,
learned from your perspective very much.
and likewise, likewise. And as a closing comment, let me say that, Whitehead is taking very seriously the best ideas of his time. He's not rejecting anything in Einstein's work. He's not rejecting anything in the budding work of Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg. He's trying to figure out how do we incorporate these discoveries into our holistic picture of the world. And he's having both humility in the face of those discoveries, but also ambition. Like he's being really bold in some of these proposals. And I just want to say that I do think he is embodying the character that Plato modeled for us. Plato, when he brings in Parmenides and Pythagoras and Heraclitus and Protagoras, he is bringing in the great luminaries of his day, the Einsteins and Heisenbergs of his day. And he's asking, how do we understand this? And so some of the, I think, stereotypes people have of philosophers as armchair types who, sit in a smoke-filled room and fabricate theories that have no connection to the world as we find it. I hope this conversation helps to explode that stereotype for some of our listeners to realize the best philosophers are people who are very attuned to the full range of data that is being presented to human life, to our best theories, and they're simply asking, how does it all make sense? And that's philosophy well done.
I agree. You said that beautifully. And yeah, the theory of everything is not going to be a theory developed by a physicist or a mathematician or a chemist or any combination of those. It requires, I think, philosophy and to understand the source of knowledge, which the scientists have knowledge, but there is the source of knowledge, which I think is a question. And I think it is going to go back to that idea of the universal soul, as Plato has laid out, and I think is coming through in Whitehead's work. So yeah, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to our next conversation. We'll start with that section from Process and Reality, and we'll just kind of revisit briefly what we've just discussed here. But I think we'll get into some of the more detailed and intricate parts of his work. So thank you very much. It's been great talking to you again.
Looking forward to it, James.